Good afternoon. My name is Cheryl Colfard. Welcome to panel 6C. We have 3 presenters on our panel, all joining us remotely. So I'm just going to give them a brief introduction. And then presenters, I would ask that you have a timer in front of you. You have 20 minutes each, because if you're sharing slides, you won't be able to see us waving at you to, wrap things up. And make sure when you put your slides up on the screen that you make them full screen. So our 3 presenters today, Neima is a historian. She's currently a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the University of Warwick. Dr. Annette Magid, her expertise includes American British utopian literature, poetry, theater, science fiction, and children's literature. And Dr. Julieanna is a professor of history at Siena Heights University in Adrian, Michigan. Her main areas of interest include American culture, religious studies, and women's studies. We have a varied group of topics on this panel. It should be really interesting. And we'll keep all the questions until all 3 speakers have presented, and then we should have lots of time to ask questions after that. So I will turn it over to our first speaker, Neima.
Hi there, thanks very much. I'm just going to check that you can hear me. Can I? Yes, I can be heard. Sorry, it's slightly disconcerting environment. I'm not going to risk doing any slides in case of technical difficulties, so I'll just go ahead. So I'd like to start by asking you to cast your mind back over what the last couple of years have been like. You might think of the frustration and boredom of sitting at home for weeks on end, or the fear of going out to work and not feeling safe. You might think of the queues of ambulances waiting outside the hospitals, the rise of right-wing populism, or the looming threat of climate change. And then I'd like you to recall the kinds of questions that these unusual times have given rise to. Is our society working on a fundamental level, or have people become too isolated or too competitive? Can we trust our leaders at this critical moment? As you can imagine, coming from Boris Johnson's Britain, this question has felt particularly relevant. Or have I myself been living in the right way? Or should I be using this moment as a prompt for some form of dramatic life change? Should I move to the countryside? Or shall I join a commune if I haven't already? What the pandemic has created is a moment of reckoning for ourselves personally and for society at large. In some cases, it has given rise to despair, to a dizzying sense that an entire social order might be being destroyed. But amid the despair, there's also been hope, the belief that here at last is the opportunity to build back better. I'd like today to connect our current moment with a period of extraordinary upheaval over a century ago. I'm going to talk briefly about the First World War and about the 1918 influenza pandemic. And then I'll explore a few examples out of the astonishing wave of social experiments that swept the globe in the 1920s and 1930s, and consider what united them, why they rose out of the ashes, and what we might be able to learn from them. You probably carry in your head some vision of what the First World War was like. Most of us do. It might be lines of muddy trenches in France, or men in hospital with shell shock or missing limbs. It would be difficult not to have some kind of image of the First World War, since it's one of the most commemorated events in modern history. But after more than a century of Armistice Day celebrations, it can be difficult to truly imagine how unprecedented the war was when it happened, or conceive of the depth of shock that it caused. One way to try and think about this might be through numbers. So around 60 million troops were mobilized during the war. Of these, 1 in 6 was killed and 1 in 3 was injured. Or in a single day, in August 1914, the French army lost 27,000 soldiers. That's half as many men as the American army would lose in the entire course of the Vietnam War. The mortality figures don't, of course, take into account the wider damage. So the permanently broken families, or the millions who were blinded, maimed, or otherwise mentally scarred. And they don't take into account the suffering of those who were left on the home front. So those who went hungry, since food and supplies were diverted to the armies in the fields. For instance, by the winter of 1916, some Germans were living on less than 1,000 calories a day. So that made scurvy and dysentery for the adults, and children's growth and mental development being sometimes permanently stunted. And then technological advances meant that the war was also one of the first conflicts to be reported almost in real time. So people on the home front suffered from the trauma of knowing almost immediately what was happening on the battlefield, but being unable to do anything about it, just waiting for the names to be posted on the casualty lists. I think one way to get a sense of the absolute agony of this kind of disempowerment is if you think of getting glimpses of the inside of intensive care units in the news, or checking the COVID mortality statistics online, but being unable to act to change things, and sometimes not even being allowed to leave your home. Unsurprisingly, the initial enthusiasm for the war gradually gave way on every side to pockets of disillusionment, and then to widespread anger at sacrifices that seemed to serve no clear purpose. In the later part of the war, growing numbers of people began to lose faith in their leaders, and also in the principles by which they governed. And then in 1918, in the final year of the war, the world's weakened population was devastated by an influenza pandemic. And this pandemic's been a common reference point for commentators of our own time, so you probably already have some sense of it. But just to give a quick outline, the death toll wasn't 6 million, which is just about where we stand now for COVID. It was somewhere in the region of 50 to 100 million. That's a mortality rate that's only ever lightly been exceeded by the bubonic plague in the 14th century. All around the globe, flu victims lay in bed, locked in the struggle to breathe. Some of them began to bleed from the nose, the ears, the eyes. Their lungs gradually filled with fluid, and their skin would then turn blue or black, which was a sign of impending death. The bodies stacked up outside the mortuaries. People panic bought masks and supplies and avoided one another in the streets. Nations closed their borders and argued over who was to blame for the epidemic. In many senses, it was all quite like today, except that the mortality rate was far higher and medical knowledge was far less advanced. And of course, all of this was coming on the back of the world's most terrible war. The result of the combined war and pandemic was something like collective trauma. For some people, the effect was so terrible as to destroy any hope for the future. An Indian sepoy who was drafted into the Western Front from his home in the Punjab wrote back to his brother, "Do not think that this is a war. It's not a war. It's the ending of the world." And the English writer D.H. Lawrence felt similarly that 2,000 years of civilization were collapsing before his eyes. "So much beauty and pathos of old things passing away," he wrote, "and no new things coming. My God, it breaks my soul." Few people could make sense of the suffering. Because knowledge about infectious pathogens was still in its early stages, no obvious lessons could be taken from the pandemic, only the sense of immense loss. As a result, its memory quickly became shrouded in silence. I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens with our own pandemic in this kind of comparative regard. Unlike the pandemic, the First World War had human perpetrators, so it was read as an indictment of how people had been living, something that was under human control. So people talked endlessly about how they could stop it ever happening again. Often the only result was a kind of nihilistic depression about the state of human nature. If you've read Ernest Hemingway or Scott F. Fitzgerald, you could think of their protagonists. These are men and women who've grown up, as Fitzgerald writes, to find all gods dead, all wars fought, all faiths in man shaken. As a result, they don't really know what to live for except drinking and partying. But not everyone succumbed to this kind of despair. For some of them more optimistic and determined, the end of the war seemed to offer something else, the possibility for a radical rethink about how to live. That reforming sentiment is beautifully captured, I think, in an exchange at the end of the war between a Yorkshireman called Leonard Elmhurst and a very wealthy New York philanthropist called Dorothy Strait. The two of them had embarked on a love affair, and later they would start a utopian community down in Devon together. Two of Leonard's brothers had been killed on the Western Front, and Dorothy's first husband had died of influenza when he was attending the Paris Peace Conference in 1918. She had been left on her own with 3 young children to care for. In their letters to one another shortly after the war, they talked about how the bottom of life had dropped out, how the old beliefs that they'd had about the world no longer stood the test. Leonard had expected to become a priest, but he told Dorothy that the war had destroyed his faith in Christianity. He felt that preachers had helped prolong it unnecessarily, preferring to stir up patriotic fervor rather than to contribute to the greater good. He could not join an institution that had done so much harm, and he decided he wanted to help humanity instead by uncovering a better way of living. And Dorothy's father was one of the so-called rubber barons in America, so he got incredibly rich at the turn of the century on the explosion of the industrial economy. Think of the likes of J.P. Morgan or J.D. Rockefeller. After the war and her husband's death, Dorothy questioned her father's brand of capitalist individualism. Wasn't this the very ethos that had caused the international conflict? She told Leonard that she was determined to dedicate her life and also her enormous fortune to finding a better standard to live by. So all around the globe after the war, idealistic men and women were having similar thoughts to Dorothy and Leonard. They questioned what had come before. The main Western political theory of the 19th century, of course, had been that individuals pursuing their own ends would achieve the best results for society. The state's only duty was to promote this unregulated competition. The 19th century had also been dominated by nation states competing to build the biggest empires and to stock the biggest collection of arms. And something which is also easy to forget in today's partly more secularized society is that much of this world was underpinned by religious institutions and by religious faith. So Dorothy and Leonard and other people like them felt that it was these long-standing values and structures that had caused the war. They decided that what was needed in their place was an alternative model, one that emphasized communality, cooperation, self-fulfillment. The challenge that they now faced was how to turn this theoretical vision of a better world into a reality. I'd love to talk at length about the huge range of reforming initiatives that people tried out to transform society after the First World War. But since there isn't time here, I'll just give you a scattering to give you a sense of the kind of general zeitgeist. So first there were, of course, the big revolutions. So in Russia, discontent with the status quo led to the communist revolution. In Germany, a socialist revolution swept the Kaiser out of power. Then there were a huge number of international organizations, which were funded with the aim of promoting global well-being and global harmony. The biggest of these was the League of Nations. On quite a different plane, there was a huge upsurge of enthusiasm for psychology and spiritualism. So in the years after the war, the capitals of the world were thronging with Jungians and Freudians and other kinds of spiritual gurus. And all of them in one way or another were promising to redress the world's troubles by improving people's inner life. Another popular tactic for achieving world salvation, which can also look quite peculiar in hindsight, was the popularity of Esperanto. So this was an international language which was created by a Polish eye doctor in the 19th century, but it had a big resurgence in the 1920s with people opening clubs in places as far apart as Japan, India, and America, in the hope that if everyone spoke the same language, they would never go to war with one another again. For some people, though, all of the above were half measures. The only solution to the fallout from the First World War and the pandemic, they thought, was to reinvent the social model completely. So around the world, disparate groups began dropping out of the mainstream and setting up utopian communities, by which I mean simply settlements where groups of idealists work to discover and perfect new ways of life. Hundreds of these experiments were started around the globe in the wake of the First World War. Some were big, some were small, and they varied wildly in how long they lasted and in the ideologies that drove them. But all of them were trying in some way to enact a new vision for society. Generally speaking, the utopian communities set up in the 1920s and 1930s all promoted communality and international cooperation. But beyond this, they tended to fit into two broad categories, each responding in different ways to the perceived social shortcomings which were thought to have led to the First World War. So the first type of community focused on self-actualization, which I guess in short is uniting the head, the heart, and the hand, rather than just treating people as individual economic units. As an example of this, we can go down to the southwest of England to visit the community set up by Dorothy and Leonard Elmhurst, the couple I mentioned earlier. So in 1925, the Elmhurst bought a rundown country estate called Dartington Hall. The aim was to make this a place where people could work, but where their days would also be full of learning, creativity, and a sense of spiritual communion and social cooperation. Dartington became one of the most famous utopian experiments of the era. Within a few years, there were several hundred people living on the estate and hundreds more coming to visit, including from many places abroad. There was a progressive school, two comparative experimental farms, various industrial enterprises, and departments for crafts, pottery, textiles, and many more besides. The Elmhurst work drew many well-known figures who were seeking some form of new vision and purpose after the war. One of the best known is the novelist Aldous Huxley. So he's now well remembered for his dystopian novel, Brave New World. But in the 1960s, just before he died, he wrote a slightly less good utopian novel called Island. And much of that was based on his experience at Dartington after the war. There's another instance for the utopian desire to promote fulfillment in a very different part of the world in Japan. So because of the war, a successful young novelist called Mushikinoji Senetsu turned against Japan's intense focus on militarization and industrialization. He thought this was reducing people's quality of life and also increasing the threat of triggering a future war. He wanted to model a new way of being that was more peaceable and more individually fulfilling. In 1918, with a small band of friends, Mushikinoji bought a remote plot of land in the mountains of southern Japan, and he started a community called Atare Shikimura, or the New Village. For 6 hours a day, everyone in the group helped cultivate rice and sweet potatoes and chickens. And then for the rest of the time, they all focused on leisure and creative pursuits, and also on learning Esperanto. The community remained very small, under 50 people. But even so, it inspired idealists across Japan, and it also drew visitors from places as far away as Korea and China. The young Mao Zedong even briefly toyed with the idea of setting up a new village experiment of his own in China before he became a full-blown convert to communism. The second type of community set up after the war was driven by spirituality. So many idealists feared that this was a vital dimension of life that was in danger of being lost amid the material ambitions of industrial capitalism and science, and also because of the assault of religion brought about by the pandemic and by the war. So their version of the good life turned on strict adherence, either to a religious or to a spiritual system. To give you a flavor of the type of utopia driven by this vision, we can go to the Christian settlement in central Germany, the Bruderhof. This was set up by a husband and wife team, an evangelical preacher called Eberhard Arnold, and his wife, a nurse, Emmy. Initially, they were very patriotic, very much in favor of the war, but they changed their minds as they witnessed the suffering of those struggling to survive on the home front, and also listened to the horrifying stories of soldiers returning from the battlefield. They decided that Christians could not take part in war. The war was driven by selfishness and greed, and also that it caused most pain to the poorest and weakest in society. So instead, they decided that the path to redemption for Germany, but also for society at large, lay in a new, more harmonious way of living based on the early church as it's laid out in the Bible. So to enact this vision, they set up a pacifist rural community called the Bruderhof, or House of Brothers. Everyone who joined the community shared possessions, shared work, shared daily life and housing, all in an attempt to express God's love and unity. The Bruderhof became very popular, even amongst people who weren't Christian, because it offered a positive vision for how people should be living. And in the wake of the war, particularly in a defeated nation, many people were desperate for a new, certain direction. Not all of the communities inspired by the war were Christian, far from it. One of the most entertaining in this line, in my opinion anyway, was set up in an old priory in the woods outside Paris by a Greek Armenian spiritual guru called Gurdjieff. So Gurdjieff was by all reports a strange but very charismatic man. Where other utopians after the war worked to create self-governing communities that reflected the democratic impulse of the age, he channeled another strand of the zeitgeist, a belief in redemption by a single great man. Gurdjieff gave his community the grandiose name of the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man. He ran it on the basis of an elaborate spiritual system, which he called the Fourth Way. This is very complicated, but one aspect of it involved him imposing a series of what he called psychological shocks on the inhabitants. So a successful author was made to give up his beloved tobacco and reading and writing, and to spend his weeks digging an enormous ditch across the garden in front of the priory. When he had finished, Gurdjieff ordered others of his disciples to fill in the ditch, and the writer had to stand by and watch this happening. Gurdjieff said this was to wake him up, shaking him into full consciousness. And in spite of its strange regime, the community drew an impressive roster of international participants. I think one of the most famous is a New Zealand short story writer, Catherine Mansfield. So she actually died there after a few months. She died of tuberculosis at the age of 34. But in her last letters before she died, she called her time there the very great, wonderful adventure of my life, a place where she'd escaped an outside world full of people who were fast asleep, and into one where everyone was wide awake and trying, like herself, to find something deeper and more harmonious in human existence. So some of the communities started in the wake of the war and the pandemic, including Dartington Hall and the Bruderhof, are still going strong in some form a century later. Most came to an end, though, after only a few years. And whether or not they lasted, they ended up facing a similar set of problems. So there was the issue of founders tending to have a greater talent for theorizing than for practical action. There were the tensions between ideals of cooperation and democracy and the practices of elitism and hierarchy. There was a struggle to reconcile a vision of a world that renounced all forms of materialism with the crushingly practical financial requirements needed to keep a community going. And then, of course, there was the large great hurdle for all these places and for all utopian communities, which is time itself, the difficulty of remaining relevant as the specific historical context that inspired a burst of idealism run up against a changing reality. As well as being short-lived, the communities that were set up after the war tended to be very small in scale, tended to be quite eccentric. Some of them, like G.I. Gurdjieff's Institute, were perhaps quite comic or even faintly horrifying. But they did produce ideas that were useful at the time and that gradually filtered out into the wider world. So one example of this is just planned community living, which became an inspiration for the international community development movement after the Second World War. Another is the holism of Dartington, which fed into the plans for Britain's post-war welfare state, or the low-impact lifestyle of the Bruderhof and Atarashi Kimura, which prefigured the environmental movement later. And also the people who passed through these utopias, even if they stayed for a very short time, often picked up ideas and reworked them and reenacted them in other settings. And at the same time, the very existence of these radical communities conveyed a message about the possibilities of the world being otherwise than it was. We're in another moment of dramatic upheaval now, and as in the aftermath of the First World War, the anxiety of our age sometimes produces resignation, despair, or turning away from the collective in favor of self-protection. But I think as this conference shows, there are also those who are choosing a more constructive route, experimenting with low-impact modes of communal living. I think now, as in the 1920s and 30s, I don't think these small-scale experiments are a solution to all social ills. But what they do manage to do is to encourage people to question the status quo and to believe that individuals can generate wider change through the fabric of their own lives. Okay, that's the end of my whistle-stop tour. I can hand on to the next person.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for sticking very tightly to the timing. Our next speaker is Annette Magid. Annette, are you ready?
It's Magid. Sorry about that. I had my
Oh, Magid.
microphone.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay. Thank you. Let me share my screen here. I'll be daring here. Let's see. I shall make it larger. Okay. I trust you can see that. Can you see that?
No.
No. Okay. Let me go down here again. Make it smaller. And let me go in here. Share screen. And we're going to do this. Okay. That's probably better. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Is that large enough? Okay, good. All right.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, thank you. Let me move this over here. Okay, we're gonna make this smaller. Sorry. I think you were smart not to go with the technology. Yeah, let me just move this over a smidge. All right. Okay. In order to properly assess the diligence, craftsmanship, and marketing acumen of Shaker community, one must initially focus on the founder of the Shakers in the Northeast United States in the 18th century. As a woman, Ann Lee's path was difficult. Born into a blacksmith's family, she knew what hard physical labor entailed. She also married a blacksmith, so she did not try to remove herself from life into which she was born. She had an unhappy marriage, and her 4 children died, which seemed to propel Ann Lee to encourage spiritual impulses over physical. In addition to Ann Lee being raised in a workman's home, she, like most of the children in her socioeconomic class, had not been able to attend school, so she found work at an early age, first as a worker in a cotton mill, then as a cutter of hatter's fur, and finally as a cook in a hospital. At each of her jobs, she learned skills that she would later parlay into the foundation of the Shaker community. In each of her jobs, especially as a cook in a hospital, she proved herself as highly regarded, precise worker. These traits are these and those that are reflected in the Shaker community, where industriousness, accuracy, attention to detail, and effective marketing seem to reflect the work ethic of Ann Lee. Growing up in Manchester, a city of demographic development, Ann Lee witnessed her entire region undergoing intense demographic technological fermentation. In fact, the Shakers embraced technology, unlike other groups such as the Amish, who refused to utilize any technological advance. Let me see if I can turn this on. Okay, sorry. When people from the country came to the city to work in garment mills and peddle their farm goods. Shakers were very involved with those interactions. Even though the Shakers did not regard themselves exclusively as retailers, they did have a thriving business which they conducted at storefronts within various Shaker communities. Please notice these catalogs, which date back to the 1800s. Shakers used their catalogs to market cleaning tools, seeds, herbal remedies, enabling devices for the disabled, furniture, industrial washing machines, and fancy items, including cloaks, woven baskets, velvet-lined jewelry boxes. The Shakers sold 2 levels of products based on the use and quality of each item. The less utilitarian items were called fancies, which were marketed in separate section of the Shaker shops. The cloak with an optional complete silk lining was one of the items included with the fancies. This cloak was specifically designed for infants up to 1 year old. Please note the price of the cloak was $5. That's $115.99 in today's economy, which included silk-lined hood. The Shakers may have introduced a type of ready-made clothing to sell in their shops. The Dorothy cloak became extremely popular. This particular garment was worn by Shaker women and became popular with friends of the community, the others, when they saw it advertised in the catalogs. The concept of a catalog was more fully embraced by Sears, a large merchandising corporation in the United States in the late 19th century. Like the Shakers, Sears included images of items to be sold, offering various sizes of the same product. For example, Sears sold the materials for complete houses: lumber, nails, brackets, roofing, and window coverings. These complete houses came in different architectural designs and were delivered to the purchaser at depots along a railroad line near their homestead. Since railroads were not fully developed at the time of the Shakers, they had different innovation in order to sell their goods. The community stores and the invitations extended to outside community to come and experience the Shaker way of life brought customers to the Shaker merchants' doors. Even though this may not have been original intention with the community was invited to share Shaker experience. It did serve to effectively introduce the outside world to the cleverness, cleanliness, and industry of the Shaker communities. I find it fascinating that many inventions and items that were sold in the Shaker stores were originally intended for the members of the Shaker community to help make their lives easier. The key issue at the Shaker community was cleanliness. Ann Lee was particularly adamant regarding the need to keep everything pristine. One such item included in the Shaker brooms, which were upgraded from the traditional round broom. The Shaker-made broom bristles were flattened into a device invented by the Shakers. Once the bristles were in the bristle broom press, they were then stitched across the bristles with sturdy twine, somewhat like passing a shuttle through a loom. The sturdy twine held the bristles in place so the angle of sweep was more controlled. The flat broom, invented by the Shakers, was much more efficient than the round broom shown on the right, and soon became a standard for the world. Nearly every Shaker community was involved in broom production, with large tracts of land for growing broom corn and large-scale turning mills for making handles. With excellent bookkeeping on the Shakers, we are able to learn that at Canterbury, one of the many Shaker communities where brooms were made from 1847 to 1890, with a peak production in 1860, the community produced 36,000 brooms. The broom in the slide was made in Mount Lebanon and was the last one ever made at any Shaker community. The date was November 1911. Since cleanliness was an essential element and critical part of being part of the Shaker community, they also invented and constructed whisk brooms, and scrub brushes. It was thought that these miniature brooms may have evolved from the broom technology. The quality of each broom and whisk broom reflects the skill and artistry of the Shaker craftspeople, and products came into high demand. In turn, Shakers made brushes with hundreds of thousands in nearly every community. Only Mount Lebanon affixed a paper label to their broom products. In addition to inventing, designing, and making flat brooms and variety of brushes, Shakers devised a method to clean sheets and bedding in each of the residence buildings. A huge laundry cleaning machine was invented by the Shakers to efficiently clean the tremendous amount of bedding and clothing that needed to be washed on a regular basis. When outsiders asked how they cleaned their laundry, the Shakers showed them their washing vats and wringers and agitating rollers to circulate the soap through the load of soiled laundry. Hotels, which were just becoming popular at the time, ordered some of the washing machines to accommodate their growing need to clean their own hotel laundry. It should be noted that the Shakers were not only very forthcoming with sharing their inventions, they also many times throughout their nearly 200-year history did not patent their inventions. They just constructed the items and made them available for purchase at their retail stores. Many devices were created to keep the rooms in order. While dowel hooks pre-existed, Shakers perfected them. These threaded wooden dowels were handmade and screwed into evenly spaced threaded perpendicular boards along the walls or suspended from the ceiling to support various cleaning tools, and Shaker chairs, which were suspended upside down and from their bottom rung in order to efficiently clean floors, as well as to prevent dust from accumulating on the seat. Laundry was also hung on these dowels for drying. Type of dowel hook still exists and is used in some hallways to lift clutter from the floor. Another ingenious invention, which was devised to help save hardwood floors from constant chair scraping, is the flexible rear chair grommets. I think you can see that. The chair could be tilted for easy sweeping under it. Some modern chairs, now made of aluminum, still have this feature. The enormous laundry volume was handled very efficiently with special ovens with interior shelves to keep irons constantly warm and at the ready to make ironing easier. I don't know if you can see behind me, but I actually have one of those kinds of irons behind me. Anyway, now of course we've got electricity, so this is not an issue, but back then they had to figure out a way to heat the irons fast. Also, sorting ironed and folded laundry was less problematic by using specifically designed baskets for each group. The baskets were stored in custom-made shelving. This is interesting. This clever design used by Shakers as drying racks is used today as efficient storage space for books in libraries. I'm sure you must have seen things like that, but the Shakers invented them. In addition to maintaining a cleanly, and orderly homestead, the Shakers made healthy, delicious foodstuffs, which were very popular. One product made in all Shaker communities was applesauce. They even designed a special label for specially crafted wooden tubs that identified their product. This type of branding became standard system to identify products continuously made through modern times. Okay. Because of the thousands of pounds of applesauce sold at Shaker shops, a device was needed to peel the huge number of apples more efficiently. The apple peeler was invented so that the operation of peeling apples could be handled more quickly and efficiently. I've seen apple peelers similar to this in modern appliance stores. Specially designed seed boxes were featured in all Shaker shops. Seeds were wrapped in wax paper to maintain freshness and ease for planting. The Burpee Seed Company evolved from this procedure, and seed packets are sold in small laminated packages today's stores. Since marketing for retail stores and sales was important to the upkeep and survival of the community, they utilize outreach to the community at large for a variety of properly harvested and dried herbs. It's interesting. Wanted poster here. In addition to marketing healthcare products, the Shakers also designed aids for various disabilities and wheelchairs. Okay. This particular wheelchair was one such item. This was designed for seated invalid to be able to move in different directions through the ingenious inclusion of a small back wheel that steadied the chair as the wheels at the arms were spun. This design is somewhat similar to modern wheelchairs. The four-legged cane on the left is unique design from the 1850s, which afforded the disabled person stability, not only while walking, but when they're when lowering their bodies to sit, as well as raising their bodies to stand. This design is used in modern canes with 4 feet to stabilize the individual using it. The walker on the right is a device that existed prior to the Shakers, but this unique design was foldable, and the bottom reinforcement dowels provided greater stability than the walkers that existed earlier. Many Shaker inventions utilized that which already existed, but were redesigned to a higher, more aesthetic quality, which so completely reflected the residents within the Shaker community. The Shaker innovations I've shared today represent a fraction of the numerous creative endeavors explored by the Shakers. Even though the Shaker communities no longer exist, the legacy left by industrious, innovative Shakers is still reflected in some of the products available currently in stores and on the internet. Thank you. This actually is a fancy box. They made these. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Annette. And our third and final speaker today is Julieanna Frost. Go ahead, Julieanna.
Okay, I'm hoping that you can see the slide share.
Annette, you need to stop sharing your screen.
I'm trying to get out
Okay.
of your view here, but I'm not
Okay.
being very successful. Let me see. Okay, how do I?
At the top of your Zoom screen, is there a stop share?
Yeah, I'm not seeing my Zoom screen. I'm going to have to go out and come back. So let me try it that way. That'll
Okay.
probably be the easiest way to do it. Okay, thank you. Okay. Let's see. Did that work?
No.
No. Oh my goodness. Okay. How do I unshare this thing?
Can you do anything from that end, Amy?
Yeah, help.
There we go.
Oh,
Okay,
good.
there's Julieanna. So Julieanna, if you can make yours full screen.
I thought it was.
Is it? Or sorry, to slideshow. Yeah. Yeah, there you go.
How does that look?
There's a little thing that looks like a book at the bottom that you can navigate with, little arrows if you want. Or there's something that looks like a television on a screen, on a pedestal.
Yeah, that should make your slides full screen or. No, it didn't.
I-
Okay.
Can you see anything at all?
Yeah, we can see it. It's just not in slideshow mode, so we can see the small thumbnails on the side of the other slides.
Yeah, look at the bottom of your screen.
In your computer, you have no two windows. So you need to stop share and reshare the right one.
Can you hear that? Again into the microphone.
Could you hear me?
No.
Okay, so now you need to share screen, and now you have two windows of PowerPoint, and choose the one where the slideshow is projected.
Are you there, Julieanna?
I am here, but
Okay,
now
good.
it's not showing anything
Okay.
for me. So now I got nothing.
Try share screen again. Okay, Amy's going to try and do it through the Dropbox. Oh, wait, you're up there.
Is
There
it
you
working
go.
now?
Now you've got it.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
I am starting my time right now.
Okay, yes.
Imagine yourself visiting San Francisco with no particular place to go, so you stop in at the Balboa Cafe for a bite to eat. While there, you notice several pamphlets for local events and organizations, and you see a photo of Joan Jett advertising a fan club on one and decide to jot down the address. Unknown to you, this is not only the residence of the Joan Jett Haight-Ashbury fan club, but it is also the headquarters of the Kerista Commune. This utopian movement was relatively small as far as intentional communities go, as it never exceeded 30 members, but it was a group that was attracted to innovative ideas and marketing techniques. Rules and standards in the commune changed over time, but throughout its existence, this group promoted its understanding of feminism and equality. They also created their own religion and decided to utilize new symbols and icons that best represented their worldview. One of their adoptions was Joan Jett, the famous rock singer, as their matron saint. The original leader of Kerista was John Pressmont. He dreamed of having a commune and promoted Kerista in various men's magazines in an attempt to gain adherents. Pressmont would relocate to New York from relocate from New York to San Francisco and take the moniker Bro Judd. He would date the official founding of Kerista, the new tribe, to 1971, when even Eve, born Susan Furchtgott, joined the commune. After this, Kerista began to attract other followers. When people joined Kerista, they would have a new, often whimsical name selected, such as even Eve, Geological, Blue Jay Way, Loki Doki, and so on. During its lifespan, the commune would be heavily influenced by whatever they considered to be happening at the time, but they also considered themselves to be countercultural. The hope was that more and more people would join the commune, and eventually they would change society for the better. The commune extensively produced newsletters, periodicals, and flyers. They sponsored dances, concerts, theatrical groups, educational programs, fan clubs, and a cable access television program in an attempt to attract members. A stable core group was established with approximately 19 adult members by 1984, but this was well below their projected membership of thousands. Though not radical in orientation, Kerista also considered itself a feminist group. I would argue that a liberal feminist orientation had existed since the beginning of this intentional community. One of their pamphlets described that, quote, Kerista is a feminist organization made up of women and men who participate in various cultural and artistic projects and activities around their personal interest areas. The goals of Kerista are to improve society in non-political, artistic, and social ways, and to be a support group for enhancing individual self-esteem through friendship, end quote. Another document advertised, quote, communal women, a feminist challenge, community without compromising your individuality or vocational success, end quote. In their cable access television program, Utopian Eyes, feminism was often addressed, such as the show that focused on the topic, quote, why men should be feminists, end quote. Blue Jay Way, one of the first members of Kerista, described the group in the following way. Quote, we have formed an environment in which women and men are totally equal and all children are exposed to a setting which reinforces their individual talents. In our non-sexist, alternative, intentional community, all jobs are chosen on the basis of natural inclination rather than gender. All decisions are made by everybody collectively. Children are raised cooperatively by all the women and men in the village. Housework is shared equally amongst men and women. All men are feminists and all women have leadership qualities. All income is shared and leisure is valued. Jealousy and possessiveness have been transcended, end quote. Many of the practices adopted by the collective were an attempt to create a progressive feminist utopia. Communal living and child raising would free up time for individual members to pursue other interests. On the July 1st, 1980 Phil Donahue show, Kerista member Lil stated, quote, we are non-sexist, non-racist, non-ageist. We're into equality in all of its forms, and we are democratic in the way that we operate, end quote. Though not always successful, at its core, Kerista desired to create a utopia that was truly democratic, peaceful, egalitarian, rational, and socially tolerant. Publications of the Commune, such as Far Out West Comic #1, highlighted the failure of the major organized religions to treat women with respect. The Commune explored Eastern philosophies and often used a Ouija board for guidance. Since none of the world's religious traditions reflected the beliefs of Kerista, why not create their own religion? A faith that reflected their own ideals with its own mythos to inspire the Commune.
Juliana, can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
Your
Yes.
slides are not advancing. All we're seeing is your opening screen.
Great.
Do you want Amy to advance them?
If she can.
Okay. So just whenever you need a slide moved ahead, just say so and Amy can move it ahead for you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Amy, if you could move it ahead, please. And that's Even Eve. And then the next one. That's Blue Jay Way, which I mentioned. The next one, please. That's one of their images. And you see Bro Jed, the guy with the beard, older guy there. Next one, please. And here we are, we're up to date now. This is Laugh a Lot. It was not until several years into its existence that Christians decided to formally develop its own church in 1979, the Kerista Consciousness Church. The KCC promoted the rational pantheistic belief in divinity, devotion to the ideals of humor, equality, liberation, love, an optional relationship to the goddess Sister Kerista, a positive view of reality, past, present, future, and no identity with religions, deities other than Kerista. Commune member Laugh a Lot further elaborated in his article, The Theology of Economics, that, quote, the primary purpose of KCC is to create a new institution that fosters the union of sovereign individuals and the shared worship of the divine cosmos and the ideals of Kerista. These main ideals are equality, liberation, humor, and love. There is a reason why I have listed equality as the first ideal. Individual and sexual equality are the two features that most clearly distinguish Kerista from other existing religions. From equality as the highest ideal flows the entire structure for the religious institutions and the moral code for its practitioners. Next slide, please. The Kerista mythology over time borrowed gods and goddesses, created some, and bestowed divinity upon others, but Sister Kerista was viewed as their first goddess. Comics were created which related the brand new lore of their divine beings. Some regular characters in the Commune's comics include Elijah, borrowed from Judaism, Verti from Buddhism, Washua, Native American traditions, Kali from Hinduism, and Nani, West African. Jesus appeared in many storylines as the brother to Sister Kerista. Jesus had passed the torch to Sister Kerista by giving her his tennis shoes. Their mother was the Black Madonna. Sister Kerista was the strong Black female, the goddess of equality. She actually was visualized by the Commune before the forming of the official church by at least 2 years. Next slide, please. Sister Kerista would show humans the way to liberation. Some of the storylines in the Kerista journals would introduce a living person as a matron saint for the Commune. Christians rejected the status quo. This is not a lengthy process for them to decide who was a saint, and they chose Joan Jett as their matron saint. Next slide, please. As Joan Jett is a feminist icon of rock and roll, it is perhaps understandable how Kerista would choose her as an appropriate icon for their new religion. Joan Jett recalled her early interest in rock. Quote, I started to really notice the rock and roll songs, the guitars, and I wanted to make those sounds. It was slightly out of tune guitars combined with a simple riff, and I wanted to make those sounds, end quote. Joan Jett got her professional start playing lead guitar and singing as the founding members of the Runaways, featured here, from 1975 to 1979, an all-female rock band. In the documentary Bad Reputation, Joan recalled of the 1970s, at this point there were signs the women's lib movement was really taking root. It showed so much promise. All it meant to us that we could do what we want. My parents told me I could be anything I wanted to be when I was 5 years old, and I believed them. So that's the attitude as a young child that I took into life. I wanted to do all different things. I didn't realize, really, there was this glass ceiling. Next slide, please. Joan Jett has always been transparent about her feminism and activism. After the breakup of the Runaways, Joan would embark on an even more successful career. Her breakout hit from 1981 was I Love Rock and Roll, a cover of the Arrows song. It was ubiquitous on the radio and on a new television program channel called MTV. Currently, that song is her only Billboard #1 ranking, which peaked on March 20th, 1982. Critic John Floyd has summarized in her music, she never goes beyond basic 2-guitar, 3-chord rock and roll, but her sometimes masterful songwriting and unbridled enthusiasm are essential to all but the most pointy-headed intellectuals, end quote. Some of the songs she wrote or co-wrote include Cherry Bomb, Bad Reputation, and I Hate Myself. Her songs deal with classic rock and roll themes of rebellion, partying, and sex. Similarly, Joan Jett's personal style also harkened back to the golden age of rock and roll of the 1950s, typified by blue jeans, cotton t-shirt, and a black leather jacket. Next slide, please. Rock and roll music was extremely important to members of Kerista. They regularly held dance parties in the Commune and produced a music magazine for the San Francisco area. In one of Kerista's many publications, even Eve stressed, quote, we even think mystically that rock and roll music particularly is going to play a big part in making the whole thing happen. A new global movement ruled by rock, end quote. The genre additionally was a recruiting tool for the cooperative. Kerista regularly placed ads in both local and national press that highlighted this aspect of the Commune. An ad that Kerista ran in Mother Jones magazine described its community as, quote, ruled by rock, authentic Kate Ashbury collective into polyfidelity, utopia, computers, and passion for rock music seeks kindred spirits. Free illustrated handbook, end quote. Jett received other special attention from Kerista. As mentioned earlier, they formed the Joan, Jett, Haight-Ashbury fan club, and one of their documents noted that, quote, freedom, equality, liberation, and love of rock and roll unifies fans, end quote. One flyer promoting Kerista included a prominent photo of Joan Jett and stated that, quote, Joan Jett represents the spirit of freedom that unites Keristans, end quote. There were other specific recruiting materials created in the commune highlighting Jett, such as the pamphlets 18 Reasons Why We Love Joan Jett, which listed 18 songs of hers ranging from 1976 to 1986. Another pamphlet was entitled The Moral Philosophy of Joan Jett. Next slide. The commune's paper Rockhead regularly featured Jett. Members of the commune saw Joan Jett live in concert and wrote a review for her show in 1988, Up Your Alley tour. Perhaps most amazingly, Keristans were able to speak directly to Jett when they interviewed her for their publication. April 1989 Spin magazine article called St. Joan related the entire commune talking with Jett. Last summer, the Keristans actually spoke with Joan, putting her on the speakerphone so everyone could gather around. When it came time to let Joan know she was a saint, they were kind of nervous. You see, they told her, we have this paranoia that you're going to think we're like Rastafarians and the way that they felt about Haile Selassie. You can see how they'd be paranoid that way, right? But it's not like that at all, because even though Joan Jett is a saint, the Keristans are totally into equality. We've already gone through this in our mind, they explained, before we became your fans. We know that all human beings are equal, but if they're astonishing artists like Leonardo, you are in the Leonardo category. Who was Joan to disagree? You guys are very articulate, and I don't get that weird vibe at all, she replied. Practically the patron saint of graciousness. Even Eve would also depict this meeting in cartoon form in the Far Out West comic strip, and another strip would reference Joan's music being listened to the group. There also exists video documentation of Keristans dancing naked to her song, Do You Want to Touch Me? It should be noted that Jett seems to be the only musician to be venerated by Keristans. In an episode of their cable access show, Utopian Eyes, other people are discussed as astonishing artists and thinkers, but Jett is the only musical artist highlighted as a pioneer. Don't give a damn about her bad reputation. Her music was at times used in the show's production. Jett was the only musician illustrated in the Far Out West comics, and not only in relating her actual interactions with the commune, but also in a series of fictional stories. In these portrayals as a matron saint, Joan Jett confronts and defeats a series of male chauvinistic characters. She was drawn with angelic wings and her trusty guitar. Next slide, please. It will perhaps be always uncertain as to why no other rock stars were venerated by Kerista in their creation of a new religion. Perhaps Joan's harkening back to the roots of rock and roll with her particular type of rock music and style better resonated with Kerista and Bro Jedd. Members of Kerista connected their group with the origins of rock thusly, quote, we're the next wave of hippie tribe that started the same year rock went mainstream, end quote. The fact that Joan was private about her personal sexuality at that time may have also allowed the Keristans as a polyfidelious group to better identify with her as their matron saint, unlike many other female rockers at the time who were fairly public heterosexual pair bonds. The members of Kerista certainly did want her and or to be more like Joan Jett. Jett was venerated by the group just like a saint should be. Next slide, sorry. Saint Joan Jett can perhaps be best considered for Kerista as the matron saint of liberation and equality. Through an invention of this highly creative, intentional community, Joan Jett still served as an inspiration and guardian of their feminist ideals and a focal point for their new religion. Regrettably for Kerista, they never reached their membership goals and ended in 1991, but their matron saint is still promoting feminism through her music and activism. She continues to tour regularly and was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2015. U.S. society has made gains in the realm of gender equality, but sadly, there's still a very, very long way to go. Figures such as Joan Jett inspire hope for the future. Joan Jett in an essay related that, quote, many women, girls, men, and boys have written and told me in person how they've been inspired by me in some capacity. And that is really for me what it's all about at the root. It's connection, the connection of music, of your life experiences that people recognize as their own too, that crosses the boundaries and touches people's hearts. And there you have the humble power to change things. Next slide, please. And thank you.
Thank you, Julieanna. So we have lots of time for questions. Do you have any questions yet from the Zoom world, Amy? Okay, so while we're waiting to see if there's any from there, questions in the room. Stephen, you had a question.
Let's see, where can we get? Actually, this is for you, Anna. I'm doing the tech, so I'm behind there. And my partner, Amy, who is the Zoom tech, we've been reading your book out loud and we love it. It's so well researched and so well written. But one of the things we keep coming back to is how often individuals with money seem to come in and out of the story. And how it's always some wealthy family that seems to be bankrolling the communities that you cover. So I was wondering if you could comment upon that and how important or the different ways that these moneyed families added complexities to all the experiments in the 1920s.
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks, very great accolade to be reading my book aloud. I guess there's two different ways of answering that, one of which is about the way that utopianism and elitism are kind of interwoven with each other, in that it's a lot easier to withdraw from sort of mainstream society if you have a foothold in mainstream society. So if you have a lot of money, or often if you're a man and you have a lot of kind of social rights, particularly in the period that I'm looking at, it tends to be a lot more common and a lot easier to sort of give up that position and to kind of secede from society and start something else. So that's sort of in one way, utopianism through the ages, I think, does tend to attract, not uniquely, but often does tend to attract people from kind of fairly upper and middle kind of echelons of society. And the other aspect of it, of course, is that kind of, as I said in my talk, all the communities that I write about are trying to escape from the nexus of individualistic, capitalistic gain. But it's very, very difficult to do that without some form of money making. So I completely agree that you're right. There are rich families or rich individuals who tend to either be involved directly in the communities. So Dartington is an example of that. And the effect of that is often that the supposedly democratic or cooperative or egalitarian structures are distorted by the fact that there are leaders who are rich and they're underpinning the communities. And then there's also the example of something like Rabindranath Tagore, who is a Nobel laureate winning poet, as everyone may know, and who also set up Utopian Experiment in Bengal. And he would sort of go off on these periodic begging rounds, international begging rounds, where he would basically ask for people to contribute money to his community. But the problem with that was he would always fritter it away, and he never worked out a sort of long-term system for keeping going. And I think in a way, something like the Bruderhof community, which was started by people who weren't particularly wealthy. Eberhard and Emmy Arnold were middle class, but not rich at all. And they were forced from the go-get to work out economic systems that would be sustainable, so that everyone in the community, they associated Christianity and good faith with working very hard, and everyone in the community was taught that godliness and idealism was also involved in, working from dawn to dusk, eating the sweat of your brows, as one visitor said. And they have managed to create a community which has sort of lasted more than 100 years and is actually quite wealthy through a whole range of initiatives, including making, at the moment, they have community playthings, which makes wooden children's toys. They have a publishing house and many other bits and pieces besides. So I think that certainly wealthy families, wealth is very much kind of like involved in utopianism, and often very beneficial in the short term, but in the long term can be very problematic.
Great, thank you, Anna. Mitch, you had a question.
I have a question about Shaker Inventions. how economically beneficial was the shaker trade in their inventions with the outside world? And did that help? How there were periods of crisis in the 1830s and 1870s, and then later on in the 1930s, especially with the Great Depression. Did their communal lifestyle help them weather those periods of crisis, or were they still doing plenty of? Were they still making a profit in their trade in their inventions?
Thank you for the question. Yes, the economy of the Shaker community was extremely strong, and even during difficult times in the community at large, because they had their own environment and own Shaker community, they managed very well. And they even provided some funds for the outside community by reaching out and looking for their crops, looking for other kinds of material that they could actually use in their productions. So yes, they did fare very well. I did look that up. I thought that was an interesting thing. Their inventions and all that they came up with, really amazing. Even during those slack times in the community, like the nation where we were all suffering, they were doing pretty well. The only problem, as you well know, with the Shakers was their ideology and their theology. Had they not been the celibate community that they were, they did take in children from split homes. They would reach out to mothers who were struggling with abusive husbands, and they would welcome into the community. So that was the only way they really enlarged their community. But had they not had their ideology, they'd still be around for sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Annette. Are there, okay, questions?
Yes, we have a question from Anna, so feel free to ask your question.
Hi, this is mainly for Annette, and it's a question about the significance of individualism versus community in the process of creativity and invention. I don't know how much you can speak about that. Like, I sort of was very interested in how, in describing all of these different creations, you didn't really talk about the individuals involved. It was very much that the Shakers as a whole kind of produced this. And like, certainly in the communities that I look at, obviously mainly later, there was this tension between the notion of the individual artist versus the anonymous craftsman. So in Japan, there was the kind of Ninge folk movement, which was all about the anonymous artist. But then at Dartington, there were a lot of refugees from Nazi Germany who were sort of relatively well-established professional artists who really didn't want their individuality to be subsumed in this utopian community, and often didn't really want to be associated with Dartington that much, except as a sort of base for their activities. So, I mean, it may not be something that you've come across that much, but I just wondered whether that was a sort of tension that would happen at the Shakers as well.
Thank you. Yes, I think that there were more communal thinking there. They did have people in different areas in the communities that needed things. For example, I know this sounds strange, but the circular saw was actually invented by a woman. She was working on her spinning wheel and looked out the window and saw the men with a flat saw trying to saw down a tree. And she looked at her spinning wheel and said, maybe if we put ratchets around a steel disc, we could make this into a cutting tool. And therein lies the birth of a kind of a saw, the circular saw, that was much more efficient, and they figured out how to do it more quickly. But I think individually, you wouldn't call it this person's saw. For example, they also took a Franklin stove. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but Benjamin Franklin invented this kind of stove that you could put wood in. It had a chimney Actually, I have a picture of it. I'll dig it up and bring it up if we have time. And the Shakers decided that that wasn't efficient enough. So they took his stove and made another little compartment on top of it that disseminated heat. And because they sold these things in their stores, all the other stores found out about it and it became a community thing. So I think we're looking at not an individual voice, but a total community. So it was looked at as a shaker product, not as this Rumsford's product. It was not called anything like that. As you know, it was all only, you know, a shaker product. I think I have labels too. I showed you that applesauce label, but there's so many more. They actually designed and marketed their own products with the name shaker on it. So all the communities identified themselves that way. So thank you for the question.
Thanks,
Hope that
Annette.
answers your question.
Thank you, Annette. Are there any more questions in the room? Yes.
Yeah, I could also stand here, maybe that would be good. A question for Julieanna about the Kerista community. Does the demise of the community at the end of their life, does that cast a shadow backwards over what they did during the time they were active?
Thank you for the question. I think it depends on what area of the commune that you focus on. As far as being very savvy with marketing, I think they're one of the most impressive communes that I've studied. When you look at personal dynamics of the commune, I would argue that they were very unsuccessful in that area. And that's, for me, when I write about communes, whether I do a book or whether I do an article, really does highlight how I felt about the members of the commune. And this is only an article because I have to have an affinity of some type in order to write about a group, because you're going to be living with them for a good 5 to 10 years.
Okay, thank you, Juliana. Any other questions in the room? Okay.
Yes, I also have a question for Anna. Your presentation and your book included such a great array of communities from all over the world. And I was wondering how you chose your case studies and what drew you to each of them.
Okay, so I began by doing a PhD on Dartington, which is a community which is next to my family farm down in Devon. So it was a very kind of like serendipitous, just personal thing. My grandfather was a farmer and then also started a sort of eco commune, and so there was quite a sort of idealistic counterculture in that area of South Devon. So that was my starting point, and it was extremely lucky because I studied it for 4 years and realized that it was very unusual. I mean, I think a lot of utopian communities throughout history have been very, very interconnected, and more so with the birth of the internet, but all the way through history anyway. But Dartington was like astonishingly international in its connections. And so when I was reading about Dartington and doing my PhD on this kind of one place, I became absolutely fascinated by all the other places it was connected to. And the 5 other communities that I chose to write about in my book were partly, as Julieanna says, a sort of affinity. They're places that you want to dwell on for a long period of time. They were partly wanting to balance and looking at the sort of spiritual and religious aspects of the zeitgeist, and the sort of interest in holism, the head, the heart, and the hand. And also wanting a bit of East, a bit of West, and all of those kind of things. And then also, of course, for a historian, there's always the issue of sources. So I obviously wanted to find somewhere where you could get the heart out of the experiences of the people who are in that community, because often utopian communities, particularly if they're quite short-lived, just don't leave very many traces, and you want to know about them, but you just can't unless they're contemporary and you can interview people. So it was partly just having enough access to sources. And I, in the feedback from my book, I think that the one criticism there's been is, why is Gurdjieff in there? He's not a utopia, he's a cult. But I sort of don't regret that, both because I think the story there is great, and I'm so interested in how quite a lot of very intelligent, sort of middle of the road people seem to have been captured by this person who may or may not have been a charlatan, in consequence of the whole shake-up of the world after the First World War. And also because I think it's really interesting, the question of what is the cult and what is the utopia, and having a case study to look at really kind of like brings to life that issue.
Thank you, Anna. I have a question for Julieanna.
Okay,
So my
thank you.
Okay, so my question is, Judd was really good at pulling on all these different sources, both from other religions and philosophies, and also drawing on utopian threads from earlier communities and sci-fi sources. From a religious studies perspective, how do you think he did at creating a coherent religion?
I don't view it as a coherent religion at all. My view of it is that he would see, come across a new novel idea, and then let's pull from that and run with that for a while. And there will still be certain strands that are there. But my view is that, like, some of the very earliest religious writings that he has, he's pulling through the Ouija board, and it's supposed to be Allah. So like, I really feel that he was like, I view him as a salesperson, that he's trying to create this happening so that he can encourage young women to join the commune, so that he has access to them, is my view. I feel that he's a creep.
Yeah, I'm totally with you there, but I'm glad to hear it from somebody who studies religion specifically. That's really helpful to hear. Are there any more online questions, Amy? Oh, okay, great.
Yes, go ahead, Anna.
I was just going to piggyback a question onto that, which was, I was quite interested in the images you showed of Black goddesses, Black Madonna, the Maroons, and then the small number of images of people who are part of the commune who seem to be young white women. And I just wondered about the sort of racial dynamics of the community and the religion, and how they interacted with one another. And obviously those can look quite problematic from a kind of slightly later standpoint, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the question. For the most part, these were disaffected young women from the middle class. Many of them had been raised Jewish, and Brother Judd had also had Jewish background. So I don't know how they got hooked into him that way, but he very much promoted himself as like a guru, wise older man. Here, I'll teach you about the world type of thing, vibe, which, I mean, it's not uncommon, right? We've seen this before and know how the story ends. But that's sort of, and there are very few African Americans or Native Americans, always more women than men. So the sleeping schedule got a little bit skewed for the polyfidelity and the B-fix at times, which I think for some women that was probably good. Little slight to the men. And let's see what else about it. There was a few African American women, but pretty much near the tail end of the commune.
Any other questions in the room?
Yeah, and actually, again, to piggyback on Cheryl's question too, in her talk yesterday, she mentioned that Charles Fourier was one of the influences on Brother Judd, and and Fourier had this idea of passional attraction, that everybody has these passions, and that society should adapt itself to be in harmony with those passions. And John Collins, who I'll talk about tomorrow in my talk, the leader of the Skinny Alice community, when he visited Fourier's communities, he said that was utter folly, that it's not possible to reconcile the individual and the collective will. And so you mentioned that that they didn't see Joan Jett as a living God, as the Rastas saw Haile Selassie, but they believed in equality, but they still revered Joan Jett as a saint. So did you see a lot of evidence of tension between individualism and collectivism in the Kerista commune, and contradiction?
I would argue there was a lot of contradiction in the community, a lot. I mean, think about a lot of their decisions were made by the Ouija board. Okay, so it was all over the place. With their rules, they did have very stringent rules, but they changed over time. So for example, for a while they were anti-junk, and also the way it was applied within the commune. So anti-junk food, big thing comes out, and you see then in videos Judd eating Cheetos. That doesn't work. Sometimes they're anti-homosexuality, sometimes they're anti-cunnilingus, sometimes they're pro-cunnilingus. So it's like, wait a few minutes and it's probably going to change in the commune. So I don't view a unified philosophy at all. I view, hey, what's some cool things? And I really think with Joan Jett, because there are other female rockers at this time, I think partially it's the aspirational image of Joan Jett that maybe resonated with the young women of the commune, because really as they're living out their lives, it's compartmentalized, and where they have autonomy and where they don't have true autonomy, right? You can take yourself off the sleeping schedule because you don't feel good. That's not true autonomy. That's not saying, I don't want to sleep with you right now. You're gross. Ugh, no, thank you. All right. So it's very all over the place. I hope that answers the question.
I just gonna piggyback on that one. Did Joan Jett, what their decision to choose her as a matron saint, did that happen at the same time that they had their own rock band? Because I know it was mostly women in that band, and I was thinking maybe that was why they were looking to Joan Jett at that time.
Yeah, so it would be like circa 1982.
Yeah. Okay, that's, yeah, so that timeline kind of matches up. Any other questions in the room? No? Any questions online? Okay, then I guess we'll end early. Thank you all for attending, and thank you to all of our speakers. Can we have a round of applause for the speakers? And also for our tech crew, Steve and Amy. Okay, thank you all for being here.